coming up. I'm really delighted to introduce Neil Selwyn. Neil is a professor at Monash University, and for those of us outside Australia, Monash University is in Melbourne. He researches digital media in everyday life, and he's been working in this area for many, many years and produced many books. For example, Is Technology Good for Education? And Education and Technology, Key Issues and Debates. So I think that gives you a flavour of he's not wholeheartedly pro and he's not wholeheartedly anti. He's thinking about these issues in great detail, together with his research group, the Learning with New Media research group. I'd just like to tell you briefly about some of the process of inviting Neil to this conference, because I think it's a good example of the sort of international reach of learning analytics. Javier, who's a program chair with me, and I were in Uruguay. So Javier's from Ecuador, I'm from the UK. We were in Uruguay, invited by Plan Ceibal to talk about learning analytics, and that's where I first met Neil, who was over from Australia. So we were sort of Europe, South America, Australia all together. And Neil posed a series of really challenging questions at that event that I thought, wow, as a learning analytics community, we haven't necessarily thought about these things, because he was thinking about learning analytics and big data and technology from the perspective of sociology and what's going on here, and thinking about it a bit from the outside, and asking questions like, in whose interests is this working? Who benefits? In what ways do they benefit? What are the underlying values and agendas which are implicit? And I thought, wow, I've never really come at it from that perspective, and I'd really like to hear more about that. So I'm delighted that today we're going to be able to hear more about that, and I'm going to be able to hand over to Neil. So let's give him a big welcome.
Well, many thanks for that, Rebecca. I'm really happy I'm not just regurgitating what I said in Montevideo, otherwise it would be very boring for you. Well, it's an honour to be here. I mean that. I'm very happy to have been invited here. So, I mean, thanks to Simon and to Brooke and for Grace, who are the three people that particularly kind of dealt with me coming over here for setting everything up. So I'm very happy to have been invited. I'm also a little bit suspicious of having to be invited. I mean, none of you will really know who I am because I don't work in the area of learning analytics. I've got no background at all in data science or instructional design or learning science. I'm not really part of the group. But Simon initially pitched it to me in his email that he thought it would be a good idea to invite me here as an outsider, someone who might have, as Rebecca said, kind of slightly off-kilter, different views about what's going on in this space. However, he then later emailed me to say, by the way, don't think you can get away with just coming along and mansplaining ideas about ethics and privacy and reductionism. We're all over this when we do have people that think about these things. So now I'm doubly suspicious about why I've been invited here. But the first thing I want to say then is please don't take anything I'm going to say the wrong way. I've got three provisos I'm going to kind of start with just to try and get myself out of trouble. First of all, I'm well aware that not all of this is going to work well. I'd love to blow your minds with 50 minutes of amazing insights into learning analytics and data science that you've never thought about. That's clearly not going to happen. I think a realistic hit rate for me is going to be about 20% of this is going to work. I think 50% of what I'm going to say, some of you, all of you, are going to know already. And you'll be thinking, yeah, whatever, we know this, fine. 30% I think may kind of annoy you, and you might think that's absolute rubbish. Why on earth is he saying this? And that might kind of get you a bit angry. Maybe 20% might be what Rebecca's talking about, stuff that you've perhaps not heard argued in terms of learning analytics, ideas or insights or just approaches that might get you thinking differently. So there's some predictive data for you, 20% hit rate. But in all seriousness, I hope all of those three reactions should be useful. I hope that they're useful. I mean, if there's stuff that I'm saying that you think, yeah, we know this, it's actually quite interesting to think, well, why are these issues not more prominent in the general conversation about learning analytics? If you guys are all over these issues, when learning analytics is talked about outside of LAK, why are these issues not seen as being kind of everyday things that people talk about? The stuff you think is rubbish as well, I think, is quite interesting. Why, if I do say something that gets you really angry that you think is absolute BS, why do you think that? What is it that makes you so angry about that perspective? Because I'm not saying this just from my own thoughts, a lot of what I'm saying is just stuff that people are saying in the wider education community. So what is it that really riles you, and why might other people think that way? And then the third stuff is a bonus, as I say. If I can get some interesting ideas, if 20% of what I say is interesting, that's probably more than any other keynote I've ever done before. So bear with me. The second proviso is I'm not strictly sure what I'm talking. I'm not trying to pass myself off as a data scientist. I don't want to pass myself off as a learning analytics expert. I am really interested in issues surrounding data and education, but probably not in the same way that most of you are. If there's a field which I sort of am trying to get myself into, it's what's called critical data studies, which is something completely different. So, I mean, please forgive me if I don't get the finer technical details of learning analytics systems and algorithms right. I'm not 100% sure what learning analytics is. I don't really think I'm 100% sure what learning is, to be honest with you. That's not really the kind of space I operate in. And also, in terms of me not strictly knowing what I'm talking about, very little of what I'm going to say today is my own and unique insight that's come from my own kind of inspiration. A lot of it is just arguments which are in the areas which I work in, the literature that I work in. So I'm drawing on a lot of other people that work in this area as well. And third of all, I'm not trying to speak and say any of this from any delusions that I've got a superior perspective or I've got all the answers. And I know, you know, I'm not claiming that any of this is going to be giving you any better answers or doing anything better than what you're doing already. And I know actually when Simon sent me the email and sent me a bunch of stuff to read, there's whole debates that have been going on in LAK over the past few years about ethics, for example. You've been developing, is it the delicate checklist? You've got the Sheila stuff that Jargan's doing. You've had some great keynotes in LAK'18, I think. You had a great philosopher come and talk to you about ethics. I mean, these are conversations which are certainly taking place within LAK already. So all I'm trying to do is just offer some more ideas. I'm not offering better ideas or any particular amazing insights. I just want to be constructively critical. So I don't think I'm going to change anybody's minds, but I think it could be quite fun if we start to think slightly differently about learning analytics for a while, even just for the next 40 minutes. So after that, we can forget this ever happened, never mention it again. You can just go away and do what you were doing before. So, right, this is a good start. I think this is going very well. We've already established it's not going to work. I don't know what I'm talking about, and I don't have any answers. So you might be thinking, why the hell am I listening to this idiot for 50 minutes? This is not why I flew 10,000 miles, paid thousands. I think LAK and learning analytics has reached the stage where you have to start engaging with idiots like me, because this is now a huge commercial concern. It's a big deal. Learning analytics, I think, has tipped over to become a real mainstream thing in education. It's been touted as a game changer, the next big thing. It's a huge kind of commercial interest, and more importantly, it's been rolled out across universities around the world, hundreds of thousands of students, and the school sector. And I know one of the emphases you've got this year is on K-12. These technologies are no longer just a niche kind of thing. They're now beginning to define what goes on in. And so I think we really do have to start taking this seriously. The stakes are ramping up, and your field is coming under increasing scrutiny from policymakers, education leaders, teachers, parents, the general public. All non-specialists who couldn't care less about the finer points of data science, but sure as hell have a really strong opinion on the rights and wrongs of using data in education. So I guess these are things that it's really good to now start talking about in a venue such as this. So everything I'm going to say, I hope, is based on kind of real-world concerns about learning analytics. I mean, you know the promises and the potential and the technical possibilities of learning analytics all too well. But I think for the field to really, really grow and become a viable part of mainstream education, you've got to engage continuously with the problems that other people have with what's going on. And as I said in the kind of abstract when I knocked something up for Simon, a lot of people outside of learning analytics, and particularly outside of LAK, have a really uneasy and suspicious approach to the use of data in education. It is a controversial proposition. So the key thing I wanted to think about today is, why is this, and what can the learning analytics community do better to address these issues? And I think in some instances, it's probably just a kind of PR thing. It's a case of better explaining to people that what they think is an issue isn't really an issue, or that you are all over it. But also perhaps there might be some instances that it might be good to think about developing different approaches to learning analytics and data in education. Already you're all looking really nervous. As I say, don't take all of this completely seriously. But I'm going to aim for an act in 5 parts, so 5 parts to the talk. So my part number 1 was just thinking about why is it that a growing number of people really don't like the idea of learning analytics and data in education. And it's easy to forget in a conference like this that there are these sort of other views to the field. Now, I'm always interested in people's reactions, and when people start talking about education and when people start talking about education and technology, my ears always prick up because I've spent 23 years working in this area with very little interest from anybody. So when it hits beyond academia, I'm always fascinated. And there was some shocking evidence last month about how people feel about data and education. I don't know if you've heard of Michael Rosen. He's one of the UK's, he's a real popular children's author and he's a poet. You might know him for his work, We're All Going on a Bear Hunt. We can't go over it, we can't go under it, we'll have to go through it. Little Rabbit Foo-Foo. Now, there's some really important references to start the day off. Michael Rosen tweets about education quite a lot, and he tweeted last month. First, they said they needed data about the children to find out that they're learning. Then they said they needed data about the children to make sure they were learning. Then the children only learnt what could be turned into data. Then the children became data. Now, I tweet a lot about education and data, and after 16 hours, I don't ever get 3,700,000 likes and 2,000 retweets. This thing just went kind of, for education, it kind of went a bit viral. And there were so many comments afterwards from teachers and parents and other people just saying, yeah, and this is why I left teaching, and I feel complete. It was really interesting to read it. If you want an alternate voice on data and education, read the comments to Michael Rosen's tweet. Now, reactions like this are not your fault. It's nothing to do with data science. There's been a massive backlash against technology and against education technology over the last 12 months, which you'd think I'd be very happy about. I'm not massively kind of pro or anti-technology. But I reckon 2007 was the tipping point where it suddenly became cool to be disgusted by technology, to be suspicious of technology. The kind of neo-Luddite movement has sort of risen up again. Post-NSA revelations, post-Snowden, Russian hacking. The reason that television programs like Black Mirror are so popular is there's a mood to be kind of dystopian and suspicious of the role that technology is now playing in our everyday lives. Dana Boyd is always a really interesting person to listen to. There was a quote from her last month. There's more urgency in 2018. More people are realizing that digital media is real, embodied, and deeply political in design with far-reaching material consequences. So you've got things like the EU pushback against Google, the Data Protection Directive. Surveys carried out in the UK, more than half of the UK population do not believe technological benefits are going to be evenly shared across the society. It's now perfectly cool to be suspicious of technology. So learning analytics is kind of swimming in that pool. So Michael Rosen can tweet and people, feel emboldened to say, whoa, this is all very creepy. And in education technology as well. I've been critical of education technology for 23 years. And whenever I write anything, silence, tumbleweed. No one could care less. This article comes out last month from The Guardian. Nothing special, and it's actually, apart from the lurid headline, the actual article is pretty sensible. It just looks at different academic research. Again, 590 comments, 1,300 shares. And again, the comments, most of the comments were all really sensible, long, involved comments from teachers and parents saying, yeah, we have got too much technology. I'm really worried about the way this is going. I'm quite happy to ban laptops or ban mobile phones, and all of these things are now becoming more mainstream discourse, which might appall you as people who are kind of involved in technology and education, but it's becoming more of a popular stance to be anti-technology. And so as the article starts off by saying, you've got these mea culpas now from Silicon Valley ed tech startup entrepreneurs suddenly saying, we were wrong. We realised now our product wasn't going to disrupt or revolutionise education. Audrey Watters has written very kind of eloquently about these ed tech confessionals. And you've got these massive pivots now. Something like Alta School in the States, which was the poster child for data-based reform of schooling, suddenly closing schools down because they realise that's not the way forward. Really controversial. And it shows, I think, that the honeymoon is over. I think the 2000s were a real sweet spot for technology and education, and maybe the first 5 years of the 2010s as well. I think as we approach the 2020s, there's a real kind of negative mood about technology and education, which learning analytics kind of finds itself in the middle of. Now, all of that, I think, goes to show that data and education, learning analytics and education is not a neutral thing. This is probably the key point of my talk. It's political, and we're talking about learning analytics as a political thing. Now, there's a popular view that technology is neutral, you know, can only be used for good or bad purposes. It's not inherently good or bad itself. So guns don't kill people, people kill people. Pencils don't make spelling mistakes. People make spelling mistakes. That's clearly nonsense from my point of view anyway. My whole field is based on the premise that that's nonsense. A gun is intrinsically designed to kill people more than a pen is, for example. So any technology, when it's first designed, is laden with values and assumptions and intentions and agendas. And that technology, when it's developed and produced, is laden with more values and agendas and interests. And then when it's marketed and sold and distributed, laden with even more values and agendas and intentions. And then when it's used, and then when it's talked about in a conference with 100 people in Sydney, at every point on the way, technologies are value laden. And consequently, the outcomes of technologies differ for different types of people. Now, none of this is the fault of anyone in particular. It's not the fault of end users for not understanding what the technology is. It's not the fault of designers because they're naive or they're somehow evil. It's just because technologies are political at every stage of their life. So this leads us on to the question about learning analytics and politics. Now, there's a kind of famous book chapter in my field by a guy called Langdon Winner, who wrote a book called The Whale and the Reactor. And chapter 2 of that, he asked this question, do artifacts have politics? And he argued that yes, in 2 ways, every artifact and every technology has politics. So he argued in the first instance that technological artifacts are designed and implemented to have particular social effects. You might not consciously know this when you're developing it, designing it, applying it, selling it, or using it, but they're designed to have particular political effects. And he used the example in the book of Robert Moses, who was the urban planner of New York, the guy who built New York, they always refer him to, and how he constructed bridges on the Long Island Expressway. And this is one of the bridges that survives. And like Winner argued that these were designed to allow cars through and not buses, because Moses was particularly anti-public transport. Winner argued that Moses was also racist, and so poor black families that wanted to try and get away on public transport couldn't use these expressways, whereas private cars tended to be owned by white middle-class families could. So he was saying this bridge, looks like a normal bridge, is inherently political. Now that story kind of there was a lot of pushback against that for people that worked with Moses and said, no, he wasn't racist at all, and there was lots of other ways of getting there. But it's interesting to think about the way that this bridge is designed and what it allows you to do and what it doesn't allow you to do and what it allows other people not to do and to do. This bridge has politics. That was Winner's argument. And there's lots of other examples you can think about this. Winner also talks about scythes when they were used in cotton fields in the 19th century. And they used to use short-handled scythes, which is the least technically efficient way of scything down crops. But the argument Winner used there was if you've got a short-handled scythe, you're down here scything. And if you're stood up, you're clearly not working. So it was very easy to surveil a whole field to see who wasn't working, because it was the person that was stood up. And the more you look for these kind of politics of artifacts and technologies, the more you see them. When I used to live in London, our local supermarket used to have these trolleys with these big poles on them, and I couldn't work out why it was, because it wasn't helping me wheel my trolley around, but it was stopping me running out the door with the trolley, because it was a poor area and a dodgy supermarket. And I used to go to Waitrose occasionally, and I'd get given a huge trolley and be allowed to kind of wheel it around. It's really difficult to get a bench to sleep on at an airport. Those of us that are going to be stuck in the airport tonight, we're not going to get any skip. Now, why is that? Because they're designed not to allow you to sleep. When you look at the furniture in airports, they're really cleverly designed. And they're also very cleverly designed to stop homeless people sleeping around cities. These benches have politics. And you can see other forms of defensive architecture around cities which also have politics. These tend to pop up in the City of London to stop people sleeping in doorways. So all of this, I'm just trying to get across that clearly everything we use has some kind of politics to it. Not necessarily voting Republican or Democrat, but trying to get people to do things in particular ways which relate to values. Now, Winner's other argument was that technologies also have politics because they fit with certain social conditions and political arrangements in order to work. And he used the example of nuclear power stations. Nuclear reactors required the existence of strong, centralized, authoritative states. No one in their right mind is going to set up a nuclear power plant in a kind of very dodgy, unstable state. And you can think about other technologies in this way as well. And clearly then that gets us thinking about learning analytics. So one of my questions is, do learning analytics have politics? And I think the answer to this is, of course they do. Yes, 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 hell yes. And we need to be constantly aware of this. So the two key questions strike me here. What are the politics of learning analytics then? I think there definitely are some. What are you actually doing? And why are you actually doing it? Which is a really interesting thing to think about. What values and ideas and agendas and ideologies are baked into the design of what you're producing and the ethos of what you're doing, the whole learning analytics project? Now, clearly, I think one of the values which most or nearly everyone in this room will have is making education better. That's got to be why most people are involved in education, naturally. But what does that actually mean? What does that actually involve? What do you mean by better? Because what I mean by better and what you mean by better might be very, very different. So perhaps, and again, this is just something for you to think about, I've got no idea. There's certainly a strain of individualism in terms of learning analytics. It's about individual learners or students getting those data to make decisions about what they do. So there's a strong individualistic politics to this. I'm always convinced there's a bit of libertarianism there as well, but I'm not sure about that. Maybe some of the politics are based around a belief in rationalization. The idea that, you know, we can kind of somehow have prescribed rules and procedures and ways of doing things, and that makes learning more effective. Is there a form of Taylorism or scientific management going on? Is there a form of techno-solutionism, as Evgeny Morozov says? You know, the idea that we can fix big problems using technology and data. It's interesting to reflect on what the politics are of what's going on here. And it might not be stuff that you're conscious about, but it's implicit in what takes place. And the second question then relates to the whole idea about the contexts within which learning analytics is being taken up. And this is a key point. Education since the 2000s has become really, really datafied. Data is the most important issue, I think, in education. Rebecca and I were just talking earlier about working in a university. Metrics, standardized tests, audit culture, accountability, evidence-based practice dominates the way that HE works, and it dominates even more the way that schools work. I was reading a book on the way up about early years classrooms and how early years, age 2 to 4 in the UK, having to produce reams and reams of data about babies, basically, and how they're developing and how they're interacting with. And the data is everywhere. So we're entering a kind of an education environment which politically is all about data and also about learning. Gert Biester talks about learnification, where you cannot talk about education in any terms apart from learning. Learning, 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 learning. Now this is key because learning analytics then is not being implemented into a vacuum. It's been implemented into an education system which is desperate for data, measurement, quantification, and is also being foisted onto education publics which are already beaten down by data and measurement and quantification. So if you think about learning analytics in this way, I think that really explains why learning analytics is booming at the moment, why there's a huge appetite from leaders, administrators, all sorts of people in education to take up these systems, but also why so many other people are resistant or fearful or opposed to analytics in education. So it's really important to understand that learning analytics is not a neutral thing that's just going to diffuse through our education systems. It's already a site of conflict and struggle and disagreement, and it's not going to be even more so. And I think at the heart of learning analytics in universities and learning analytics in schools is a struggle for ideals and ideas of what education is and what education should be for. And this is the kicker. A lot of people do not think that education is about individuals. A lot of people do not think education is just a case of individuals making better decisions about the choices they make in terms of improving their learning. And a lot of people are not convinced education is about competition. A lot of people are convinced education is not about an obsessive focus on learning. And none of this is good news for learning analytics, but I think it's not disastrous. But I think we need to kind of start from that point, that learning analytics is political and it's entering this really kind of tricky arena. Now, there are lots and lots of things. You've heard all this stuff before. And nobody's stupid. This is the thing. No one's stupid. You know this. And if I was naive, I'd stand up here and say things like, oh, garbage in, garbage out. You know, the volume of data is not the same as value, and oh, it's all a bit intrusive and surveillance, and people find it creepy. And you hear these things, and I've called them well-worn gripes, but I'm sure you can think of a less polite way of putting them. But you hear this stuff all the time. And it's tempting just to kind of gloss over it, because you think, yeah, privacy, blah, 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 surveillance, let's get on and do the more exciting stuff, data science stuff. But I think actually a lot of these kind of woolly, liberal, hippie kind of pushback that you get against data and education are worth kind of drilling down to and thinking about what issues underlie them that are really, really fundamental to working out what learning analytics is. Now, the first one is this idea of representativeness. And I'm sure, again, this is stuff you've heard lots and lots of times and you've thought lots about. But I mean, this is the idea that no data is raw. There's no such thing as raw data. It's created by design, imbued with values. No data are collected. You generate data. Data don't exist. You just kind of mine them or pick them. And no analysis is just data-driven. Analysis is driven by ideas and assumptions and theories. And so if you see things in this perspective, you can see again why people are maybe suspicious of learning analytics, because when you say that you can represent learning through data, you're picking particular forms of data and therefore missing out other forms of data. So the big problem is that the data points you're choosing may be different from the data points that others would choose or prefer or think should be. And this leads to this issue of people saying that, yeah, learning analytics is not representative. But this is an issue throughout the history of measurement and the history of quantification. So it's really interesting to read the history of media literature on this. So people like Gitelman argue that different disciplines have always imagined objects and used different data sets to construct those objects. And that harbours different interpretive structures of their own imagining. So whenever you go to kind of non-data science conferences, you'll always hear people saying, well, everyone's looking at, is it the waterline of visibility? You can look at rape behaviours and maybe gender, but you can't say anything about culture or values or religion. I mean, I hate slides like this. Aesthetically, they're horrible. But also, I would disagree with all the things below and a lot of the things above. But you get the idea. There are some things which people say can't be represented through data. Now, the key thing when you hear arguments like this is nobody's wrong and nobody's right. But it's a subjective thing. So Cathy O'Neill is a really interesting person on this issue. She says, when you hear somebody say data are objective, that just means that they got to choose the definition of success. So as I've said before, data are political. So claiming to be able to kind of represent something that's as complex and emotive as learning is always going to be hotly contested. It's a real, real provocative thing to do in education. And you can see then why people are tweeting Michael Rosen saying, I've left teaching because of data. Now, an allied argument to this is this idea of reductiveness, that by its nature, data is reductive. But the argument here is that when we've got complex social phenomenon, it's even more reductive. Now, every data scientist knows that most social facts are really fuzzy. You can't really pin down most facts. I was really interested when I was coming in here, what is Sydney? Is it the CBD? Because I've wandered around the CBD, so have I been to Sydney? Is it a certain postcode districts? Is it certain electoral wards, which are different to the postcode districts? Is it just 30 kilometres from Circular Quay? Is it a particular way of speaking or behaving? Is Sydney Mardi Gras, or is it going to see the Rabbitohs? I mean, there's all sorts of different ways you could define Sydney. None of them are right, none of them are wrong. But if we can't agree what Sydney is, how on earth are we going to say with kind of real confidence about somebody being motivated or fearful or engaged or confused? And most of the really important aspects of education are really, really slippery. Race is not a variable, it's a social construct. Social class is really difficult to quantify. And then you get onto things like emotions and motivations and attitudes and feelings and affect and all of these things that are really important to educational or social settings. Having butterflies in your stomach, for example. How can you quantify, how can you even describe that in words? It's really, really tricky. Now, these human factors, I think, lie at the heart of why many people in education and many people like Michael Rosen have a problem with data and education, because they see learning and education as this real unquantifiable thing. This is just an article by Marley Bali, who writes really well on technology and education, but I was just struck by this thing which I've tried to highlight in grey. The choices of which data to collect are usually made by the techies and the policy. She's not kind of being kind of neutral on this. not teachers and students. Do teachers really need to know this stuff, and should they be asked to look at this data to make decisions about their learners, or should they instead say, actually look into their students' eyes while teaching them and maybe, you know, ask them what they're thinking or feeling or how they felt about these readings? Now, you might see this as hippie nonsense or stupid, and when I read the comments, the first one is from a data scientist saying, this is very troublesome. You might see it as troublesome, but it's just a different perspective on things. It's informed by different ideas and ideals and values about what education is. And the trouble is with education that a lot of educators and parents and students don't see proxy indicators as proxies. They see them as just direct truths. And they don't see indicators as indicators. Again, they see them as kind of direct truth. So if you start saying, oh, I've got these proxy indicators about learning, people are just going to hear you saying, I'm telling you what learning is. And that's going to really kind of rile people up. And this reductionism is multiplied tenfold when you start having traffic lights and dashboards and everything becomes visualized, because it reduces it down again. Now, the third well-worn gripe is this idea of models of learning. I mean, we all know that learning is not something that can be measured directly, but it's not often clear how it's being modeled, I guess, in the uses of data in education. So, I mean, this is, again, a kind of pushback against learning analytics. What is your model of learning? If we accept that all attempts to describe learning as guesswork, it's not often clear on what basis you're guessing. So I guess the questions people have is, what models or theories of learning are learning analytics operationalizing? Do you have a specific theory of learning at all that's being used, or are you just going with whatever data you can get hold of and then retrofitting it? And if you are using a learning theory, does everyone involved in the development and implementation and use of the system recognize the limitations of the model and the theory being used? And I guess to many outsiders, it just seems that a lot of data systems in education are kind of imbued with a behaviorist model of learning at best, which might seem really unfair, but it does raise the question of what you're doing if what you're doing isn't behaviorist, and then how appropriate your learning theory is. So, I mean, there's two things here. How applicable is any theory of learning that you're using to digital contexts? I'm really amused still that people use Vygotskian theories of learning, which were developed in the 20s and 30s in Russia, a long time before digital technologies were evolved. Even people like Seymour Papert, the 1980s was a very different context to the 2020s. And then, as I think other people have argued within the community, here, how applicable are the theories of learning to the specific contexts you're working in? Western models of learning, are they applicable to Eastern contexts? Northern theories as opposed to Southern contexts? There's all sorts of different ways that, as Ben Williamson points out, theories of learning are really context specific, which means you can't scale any form of learning analytics with impunity, because the model you're using in one context might not fit another. So you need learning theories, but you also need more than just one learning theory. And this is really, really tricky. And a couple of other kind of well-worn gripes. This idea of context. Again, you've heard this before, and it's a real well-worn criticism of AI in general. And I like this quote from Fei-Fei Li. The definition of today's AI is a machine that can make the perfect chess move while the room is on fire. Which led me to think, how aware of learning are learning analytics systems of what's going on around them? Are we just analysing learning while schools are on fire or universities are on fire? And this relates to two things, the social context and the context of what a learner is, which is an interesting thing to think about. So in terms of social context, for example, which is my first point, it's really interesting to think about what shapes the social context that education's situated within. We've got organisational structures of schools and universities, from timetabling and scheduling to the enactment of kind of standardised testings and curricula. You've got the ethos of the institutions, whether it's an Ivy League university or a community school. You've got much broader contextual influences about class, gender, race, ethnicity, students' home life, students' mental health. And then you've got whole bunches of stuff around national culture, religion. There's all sorts of stuff beyond the individual and the teacher in a classroom. And then when you think about learners as well, and I prefer to call them students because learners tend to assume that people are learning, whereas a student is just someone that's in a school doing things they have to do in school. You could argue again that our models that we use in education, I think, but also in learning analytics fall short. We've done lots of research on sociological studies of the student experience and realities of contemporary schools and universities. And most often we find that students are not learners, which is a real tricky thing to get your head around. But most students, when we do the research in the schools and the universities, are often looking either just to get by I just want to survive the school day. I couldn't care less what I do. I need to get out of here. Or looking to get on. I want to do well in the system. I want to get good grades. I want to progress through. I want to go to uni. I want to get a good job. Which is really interesting when you think of learning analytics, because often students, I think, are not necessarily really curious, empowered learners that are looking to make better decisions about what to do next. They just want to get a good grade or a good grade average. I've seen it suggested, I think, in one of the papers from this conference, this means students are not very curious or they're not very data literate. I think actually you could argue they're being pragmatic and strategic about what they do in education institutions. They don't need more data about what they could be doing. They know quite well what they're doing, either to get by or to get on. They're not engaged in education in the ways that we assume, or that we hope, or that we used to be engaged in education. Now, in extreme cases, you've got students paying companies to do their online learning with them. There's this rise of companies now that will do online discussion forums, online classes, anything that's done via a learning management system on behalf of... And so savvy students who are time poor but want to get on will employ a company to do it for them. That's an extreme case. But when you talk to students about how they learn, often they'll speak about strategic learning or defensive learning or surface level learning, just trying to get by. And I don't think that's what a lot of the learning that you're interested in is about. But that seems to be what a lot of the learning that goes on in education institutions is. Now, these are all very familiar criticisms, and I'm sure these are things you've heard a lot of, but I think they lie at the heart of the pushback that learning analytics faces. And a lot of it comes down to whether you agree or disagree with statements like this. A lot of people outside of data science and data in education would argue there's never, ever going to be adequate data points to capture what learning is, what a student is, what a school is, or what a university is. And I guess most people in this room would probably think there are enough data points. We do have enough data. So this is a real key, and in some ways this is an ontological problem, which is not going to be easily solved, whether you're an objectivist or a constructionist. It's a kind of ideological tension. It's a political tension, but it's not going to be kind of easily solved just by having a better system or, you know, getting rid of technology altogether. It's really, really tricky. And there's one other well-worn thing which is possibly worth thinking about when we think about what we might do better, and this is this idea of performativity. And the suspicion and the fear that people have that learning analytics fundamentally alters the conditions of the school or the university. Think about, what does it mean to be a student in an educational environment that's full of learning analytics? What does it mean to be a teacher in an education setting that's full of learning analytics? A lot of people think that learning analytics makes people behave differently and think differently about what they do, but not in a necessarily good, beneficial, healthy way. So people argue that learning analytics is the kind of silent teacher in the room now, that data scientists and programmers and algorithm designers are the most powerful teachers that set the conditions of what takes place. And we know this from our everyday lives. There is lots and lots of literature on the constitutive effects of performance indicators, for example, how our practices are shaped and formed and reconstituted in the light of the way that we're measured and the way that the indicators that are used in our fields of work define what they claim to measure. Sometimes we just act in the way that we think will please the machine. Sometimes we try and game the system. But if we know that analytics is taking place, we tend to kind of change the way we do things. So as an academic, I'm defined by two key data points, whether I'm flagging purple in my student evaluations, and I have to flag purple, otherwise I don't get promoted. Purple is above 4.6% in my university, 4.6 out of 5 in terms of student evaluations. And the other thing I get judged on is my H score, H index. How many people have cited my paper? That's it. You can tell who I am from my purpleness and my H-ness, which is fine. So I do things which make me purple, and I do things which make me H, which is why I'm here today. But so you can kind of, we all do this. In every field, we all do this. And in a context that's overlaid with analytics, the focus is going to be on the things which are being analysed. Now, I think, as I've already hinted, this is sounding far more gloomy than I hoped it was going to be. These are all things that are impossible to overcome. That's the bad news. The good news is that there's nothing specific about education or unique about education. As I say, workplace surveillance is common. Universities are full of crazy metrics. I was reading last week about Michelin-starred chefs giving up cooking because they just can't handle the pressure of being monitored by Michelin to have their stars taken away. These are problems that all aspects of society are having to work out. So we're not alone here. But there is something about education that people think is slightly special that also makes it slightly tricky to apply data to. That education's inherently social, inherently contextual, inherently subjective. That means you can't objectively rate it, measure it, indicate it. So, you might not agree with any of that at all, but hopefully you can see why people find this oppressive rather than liberatory. It's not just a kind of good thing. And just before I move on to what we can do about it, because I do have a few answers or a few ideas, there's also a few things which I don't think get talked about a lot in data and education, which might be less familiar. I was really interested that I think the theme of the conference was looking at the users, or there was something about looking back to the users, which I was fascinated by, because to me, I don't know who you've talked about as users, but I don't think they're students and I don't think they're teachers. For me, learning analytics, the users of learning analytics are university principals, leaders, administrators. That's who learning analytics systems really work in the interests of. Possibly software vendors, the people that are beginning to sell these systems, possibly third parties who either want to buy data for either kind of crude advert or want to buy data to make a claim and model how learning happens, which is the holy grail of education data mining. Those are the users of learning analytics. And I'm also really interested about conversations about how perhaps the end users of learning analytics are increasingly non-human. There's some really interesting arguments now that there are many more machine users on the internet than there are human users. Lots of algorithms and other systems and other bots. And in fact, a lot of data systems are now just, the results and outcomes of data systems are just being reused by other data systems and other machines. So in some ways, you need to move away from user-centered design to designing the user. In other words, software developers getting involved in developing systems which will use learning analytics. So you're not just developing a learning analytics system, you're developing the systems which use learning analytics, which completely changes the game. We've got non-human users and we've got these kind of upper echelons. And teachers and students, I think, are the least important users of all of these systems. There are lots of other kind of boring, woolly liberal concerns about learning analytics that don't often get talked about. This idea of not altering the nature of public education, and I mean public education in particular. First of all, the way that database systems tend to individualize education processes is often a real big problem when we talk about education as a public good. Education is a collective thing. If I succeed, it's not because of me being a brilliant learner, it's because of my teachers, my classmates, the context within which I'm working. I wouldn't take claim for any education success I have, and I wouldn't take claim for any education failure I have. But a lot of these systems tend to individualize and self-responsibilize success and failure, which is a real dangerous thing in terms of vulnerable learners or students which are perhaps struggling. Also in terms of changing the nature of public education is the idea of commodification and commercialization as well. The idea about data suddenly becoming something which can be transferred around and has value and then used for commercial benefit, for profit, is a really tricky question in terms of who owns the data now, who owns the data in the future, what's their long-term kind of commitment to longevity, openness, and all the goals that we think that people have about data. And also this fourth point about exploitation. And increasingly there's pushback against data systems in schools as exploitative. Learning analytics takes place within the data economy, and the data economy is now worth billions of dollars. I read last month that if every time I give my email away, it's worth $78 to marketers. So it's quite good to get people's email addresses. I gave you my email address, didn't I, when I signed the consent form? So that's $78 worth of marketing information. But we're in this system now where personal data is really, really profitable. And health data, financial data, and education data is doubly profitable. And this data gets reused and recycled and reconstituted. It has a social life. So everyone in this room might be using learning analytics data for really kind of valuable educational purposes. Where else does the data then go, and in which forms? I keep getting offered from when I meet people that run learning management systems in universities, oh, you can have all the data from the last 5 years, just have a look at it. And I'm thinking, well, A, that's great. B, in terms of informed consent, I'm not sure that's why students 5 years ago were using the learning management system. Now, I'm sure it's not just me that they're offering the data to. So it's really important to think about students' use of learning analytics systems and teachers' use of learning analytics systems as labour. These people are working. They're giving you data. Free labour to either make the system better or to give data which is then profitable. And so a lot of people have this problem with students being exploited rather than kind of empowered by learning analytics systems. Now, I'll come back to that in a minute in terms of what we can do about it. Now, it's important to realise that these concerns are triggered by all kind of flavours or aspects or types of learning analytics systems. People are obviously really freaked out by neuro headsets and neurofeedback and this emotional stuff and the facial recognition. This might look brilliant to you, but it scares the hell out of a lot of people in education. But it's not just the kind of slightly more extreme versions of learning analytics. It's also the really mundane versions of learning analytics. Dashboards and, you know, there's all sorts. So it's really important to think that these aren't problems that people have with every type of learning analytics. It's the whole area. I read this morning about Smart Campus. Smart Campus tracks students' social interactions and daily routines and leverages that information to make predictions about freshman retention. So I think there's a really interesting question here about what the limits to what you see as being measurable and indicated, but it's also the boring stuff as well that people have problems with. So, anyway, I told you I've got not just gripes and criticisms. The reasonable response to everything I've just said is, right, if you're so clever, what would you do about it? I get that all the time, and the answer is, I have no idea. These are just issues. But it's not really helpful to be like that. So there are a few things I think that this critical literature suggests we need to think about in terms of suggesting change. There are some possible ways forward. So I want you to think about these suggestions, and these are all real work in progress, as you'll see in a minute, because I've just typed up a list of stuff. Which of these are really unworkable or unlikable or unrealistic? And then why do you think they're unrealistic or unlikable or unworkable? What is it that really annoys you about these suggestions? And what others do you think might be possibly avenues to think about? So I was literally typing these up till yesterday, so this is probably not going to be massively readable, but I'll read them all out. There's a whole bunch of stuff, I think, which is coming up from the literature from other people, which is interesting to think about. And I'll go through them quickly. The idea of socially sympathetic design, that was coming back to those points about context and how analytics and data fit context. It's really interesting to think about to what extent learning analytics can be off the shelf, one size fits all. Clearly one size doesn't fit all. So I think bespoke design is a really interesting thing to think about, and bespoke products. The idea of what works in a university won't work in K-12. What works in K won't work in 12. What works in Monash won't work in Montevideo. What works in Cranbrook School in Sydney might not work in Cranebrook. Context is really important. So if I was the principal of Cranebrook, I'd be wanting a learning analytics system set up that was completely bespoke to the context of my school, my students, my local community. And also this idea about learning analytics and software developers and data scientists thinking not just about themselves. I was speaking to a data scientist last week, and they were saying, oh, I really loved learning and I like learning on my own. And I was like, yeah, you would, because you did really well at the education system, and you're kind of curious about learning and you're curious about data. So learning analytics is going to work perfectly well for you. I think we need to be designing for people who do not feel comfortable with education, that don't want to be in school or university, that aren't very kind of favourable about using data in their everyday lives. Those are the people that these systems are actually kind of being implemented with. Then there's a whole bunch of stuff about algorithmic transparency, which I know you've talked about already, and people like Frank Pasquale have done lots of really interesting stuff about white boxing systems, the idea that if you hover over an indicator, it will tell you exactly how it came up with the purple, or whatever it is that it's telling you are, which is a really interesting way of thinking about things. Easily explainable learning analytics. So no such thing as a secret source, but a very, very visible recipe as to how these systems work. And I'm really interested in thinking about how we can give students control. I'm really interested in terms of requiring, for example, learning analytics systems to show users how their data is being used. Could we have systems that continuously tell students where the data is going, how it's being used? What about if we received a yearly end-of-year statement or audit from the learning analytics system that we're using that tells us where the data's gone that year, like a kind of an account, so that users are just more informed about where data are going? Because as soon as you show a user something like Lightbeam, oh, this website is selling your data to 30 different places, people suddenly start thinking very, very differently about technologies that they use in their everyday lives. And this comes back to this idea about, rather than user-friendly design, you shouldn't want to be friends with the user, it should be more user-respectful design. issues about security and transparency and privacy. And that leads us to a whole bunch of really interesting questions about selective use of analytics, for example. I've seen a few debates on the Twitter stream around this conference about allowing students to opt out of data sharing with their learning analytics that they're using. Why not making all learning analytics opt-in? You only get to use it if you want to use it. I wonder how many students would actually pick it up at the beginning of the university. Now, this might appall you from a data science point of view because it buggers up your data. But why should it not be opt-in from the get-go? And you use it if you want to. I really like the idea to give students complete curation over their learning analytics. If you're going to have lifelong learning analytics, surely there's a right to be forgotten at 18. Because I was doing some stupid stuff when I was 13 to 16. So those years when I was more interested in drinking and cars and whatever, can I just get rid of those? That's not really good analytics about my education. Or can people just kind of opt in whenever they want to? So, I mean, these might seem really unworkable and like heresy, but they're really interesting when you start thinking about ethics in terms of power rather than just protection. What about allowing students to build their own analytics? The whole stuff about students working and teachers working and money being made from data, there's a whole bunch of interesting stuff around making data a personal data marketplace, is what Stephen Robinson calls it. And that's actually where students could be allowed to sell their own data. And this is not as crazy as it seems. There are platform cooperatives such as My Data, where users can pool all their health data from their personal Fitbits and whatever else, pool it and then sell it or donate it to whoever they want as a cooperative, which is a really interesting way of thinking about it. So you could say, I'm going to give all our data to cancer research because we think they're really valuable, or we're going to flog it to whoever's going to pay more money. But the users have control over where the data goes and who gets the money. Or if you don't like that, there are also arguments about giving all users of data systems a living wage for the data that they're producing. If they're working on your behalf, why not pay them if you're going to be making money out of it? Or promise them some shares if your company suddenly goes huge. I'm quite interested in the idea of data brokers. A lot of those suggestions are perhaps not very realistic because they involve people being really switched on to what data are and how they can be used. But you could argue that we just need organizations or individuals that act as data brokers. A bit like an accountant who does your taxes. You could have a personal data broker that just looks after your personal data for you. There are also arguments about pooling learning data and education data on a huge scale. What about if New South Wales pooled all of its learning analytics from learning management systems that are being used in schools across the state, stuck it together? You'd have such a rich repository about what learning takes place in New South Wales schools that could be used for public good. That'd be a real fascinating thing to do. Or if you don't like giving all the data to the state, you could have a tithe system where, say, 10% of the data gets. But there's all sorts of different ways of dealing with the politics of learning analytics. And then we've got stuff about public understanding. I think not all of this is technical and not all of this is kind of regulatory, but there's a whole bunch of stuff about developing a better public understanding of learning analytics. And I know you've had conversations that we need principals and people that are procuring systems that know what they're talking about. But they need to not only know what they're talking about in terms of data science, but they also need to know what they're talking about in terms of the ethics and the critical issues surrounding learning analytics systems and other data systems. So making sure that we inform principals and pro-vice chancellors and the people that are involved for buying these systems, that they're really thinking about all these issues. And then also this idea of data literacy, but not seeing data literacy as educating students about data or getting them curious about data, but getting them thinking critically about all the issues I've just talked about. So there's a whole push towards critical understanding of data being taught in schools from an early age. Not just becoming a user, but becoming an informed kind of critic of data. And this then comes onto this idea about ethics. And I know you've talked a lot about ethics, so I won't talk much about that. But the idea of not just seeing ethics in terms of protection, but in terms of power. And building ethics into everything that you do, not just bolting it on at the end, but building it intrinsically into what you're going to do next. And there's a whole range of arguments going on at the moment about the quality of data is the most important ethical issue of all. And judging educational data by the same standards that we would judge, say, medical data or defense data. Lucy Suckman talks about when a drone gets data slightly wrong, it bombs a wedding rather than its target. I would be wanting to treat educational data in exactly the same ways. It's really, really important that we have the highest quality possible. There are lots of interesting arguments here about licensing systems, for example. We license teachers to be in a classroom. Why would we not license a learning analytics system and revoke the license if the system wasn't really working so well? I wasn't allowed to swim in St Kilda Beach last month because the quality of the water had dipped down below the acceptable level. So why not have an acceptable data quality level? At the moment, this system hasn't got enough quality data to tell us what's going on. You can't use it. Or even just hold learning analytics providers legally accountable for what goes on. There's all sorts of suggestions, all of them completely unworkable. But the whole point about having impractical suggestions like this is it gets you thinking about the issues. Why would I think that's an even sensible thing to say? Anyway, there's a whole bunch of stuff to think about. I just wanted to finish very, very briefly on how might things be otherwise. I've been banging on enough now, so I will shut up. You might well be thinking, what the hell has this got to do with me? This has got nothing to do with me whatsoever, and it hasn't at all. I'm not trying to double down on anyone in particular. It's not you on your own, but I think as a community, as a group of people interested in data and education, there is stuff that we could be doing here to make learning analytics a force for good. People are very quick to tell me that LAK is not a proper field and learning analytics is, it's just a bunch of people getting together and it's not really a field or a discipline. It clearly is, because you're all here, you're all doing things. I think LAK could be a real kind of force for real pushing this forward, and I'll explain in a minute. But the trouble is, first of all, that there's lots of diverse people in this room. There's lots of different tribes at a conference like this. You've got learning science researchers, you've got data scientists, you've got IT industry people, people that are working for commercial providers. You've got educational administrators, school principals. Everyone's interested in doing the same thing, learning analytics, but for very, very different reasons. So I think the first thing that we need to do, or LAK needs to do, is to declare or be more upfront about your personal interests and values and agendas. We're all here to make education better, but what's the bottom line? And there's nothing wrong for being for profit or being for disrupting the system or helping individual learners or simply seeing it as an interesting computational challenge. But I think if we're more upfront about why we're doing what we're doing, then we can begin to address some of these issues. And secondly, then, be clear about how our own personal motivations translate to the motivations of others. So this is one of the key things that I'm just interested to hear what you might want to talk about afterwards. What is the powerful idea implicit in learning analytics? What is the idea implicit in learning analytics? And then how does that relate to the powerful ideas that other people already have about education? And you might want to change the word idea with values. What's the powerful values implicit in learning analytics, and how does it fit with the powerful values that people already have? It's a key kind of tension, I think, in all the work that's going on here. So, it's all very well for me to stand here and be provocative. I would never take anything a sociologist says too seriously, so take it all with a huge pinch of salt. It's important for me to remember, I've told you one size doesn't fit all, one critique doesn't fit all either. There's many different types of learning analytics, there's many different types of school context. And it's also important that these debates are taking place all over fields. It's not just sociology and media studies, but there's a whole real interesting, most of that literature is actually from people that work in law, that work in computer science, HCI. These are debates that are going on across all disciplines. Social scientists are not the only people that are aware of transparency and accountability. So I think we need to just get together and have better conversations. And this is my final thought. I thought it strikes me that LAK, and in particular the academic side of LAK, could be a real privileged position to start taking this forward. I don't think we really need academics anymore to develop technologies. I think you may have kind of given rise to learning analytics as a field, but I don't think you're needed anymore. I think private sector's building these things, software developers are building these things. Perhaps the academic side of learning analytics is in a really well placed to take an expert, critical friend position on these things. Learning analytics now clearly comes with a bunch of health warnings. So venues like this can be much, much more vocal about what those health warnings are. Be a critical friend to the learning analytics industry. Push back against the hype. When you see people over-promising, push back against it. We know what we're talking about. We invented this stuff. It's now going a bit in different directions. I think LAK could be a real good place for these conversations to take place, because I don't see them taking place anywhere else. So I would usually finish by saying I hope this talk has been helpful. I'm pretty sure it hasn't been helpful, but I hope it's not been unhelpful. The whole point of me talking about this is just to basically provoke a bit. I'm not arguing that learning analytics is bad. but I am arguing that learning analytics is dangerous, like most potent things are. And because it's dangerous, it needs to be really kind of critically engaged with. I think learning analytics and data in education is clearly going to be defining what takes place in the 2020s, and it's definitely worth addressing it in a critical manner. So on that note, I'm going to shut up. I'm just going to say I hope the rest of the day is a storming success. I hope we all get home. That would be nice. And thank you very much.
Okay, I'd like to thank Neil very much for that talk. He said to me, can you get me to finish at 9:50? But at 9:50, he was showing us this great long list of ideas, so I didn't get him. He's gone for 60 minutes, bang on time. That's absolute skill, I think. I think it's a really challenging audience to give that sort of talk to. It's really given me a lot of things to think about. We'll be back in half an hour. We'll have opportunities for Q&A, so if there's ideas you want to discuss with Neil, things you'd like to raise, do come back here for that. Otherwise, we'll see you in half an hour. Thank you.